Now that we have all of our events in place, we should create a process for our CRM system. This process is going to be a background process that continually runs, and it will move our contacts in the CRM system. So let's come here to the processes folder. We will create a new file, call it CRM, and the CRM file is going to work very simply. We'll want to import a couple of things that we'll need, like app, and we'll create a function, and we will run that function, and we'll have a timeout here in the middle that will continuously run this function over and over again. Let's set the interval to be 20 frames a second. So that's 1000 divided by 20. Now, anything that we want to happen as part of this process will happen inside of this area right here. One thing we'll want to consider is making sure that we don't run this process for any flights that are paused. So we can do that very easily by just pulling out the flights that have not been paused or that are running. The flight has a simulator's property, and we can just grab the simulator from the app with the ID that's in the flight. Now we'll want to grab any CRM systems that are on this simulator. There should only be one, so we'll just grab that one. If it doesn't have a CRM, then we can just stop. Now we can do stuff with this CRM. For example, we'll want to move all of the contacts in the CRM system. Let's do a very basic movement system just to make sure that we know that it's working properly. We'll just pick a random destination, and then for every frame we will move the location closer to that destination. We'll want to loop through all of the contacts in the CRM system for both the fighters and for just the enemies, not the fighters. The fighters are going to move on their own, so we'll just worry about the enemies. So what we'll do is we will take the velocity of the contact and we will add it to the position, and that will make it move in a direction. And then we'll also want to have some kind of logic for it to change its velocity based on where it is. Probably some kind of randomness built into it. We're not going to make this too sophisticated. We can definitely improve this later on, but for right now we just want to make sure that the process is working properly. So first things first, let's change the velocity. We'll just increment the velocity by some random number, and that will make it so that it kind of wobbles around a little bit. And now we need to set the position based on the velocity. Okay, now it's going to randomly move our enemies by changing their velocity by some random amount and changing their position by the velocity. One more thing that we'll probably want to do is include a maximum velocity so these guys don't just fly off forever. So let's add that here in the definition in the class. Just set it to 2. That's an arbitrary number. And then we already know that our bounds are going to be -1000 and 1000 on all dimensions. So we're going to want to make sure that we bound our position based on that as well. Again, we could make this much more elaborate so that if it gets close to an edge, it ramps the velocity in the opposite direction. But for now, let's just make it so that it'll bump against the edge. So first, let's clamp our velocity here with a math.min. And then we'll use the e.max velocity. This will make it so that if this number is greater than the max velocity, it'll pick whatever is lower, which will always be the max velocity. So we'll just copy that down for these. We'll do the same thing here, except we're going to make sure that it is greater than -1000 and less than 1000. So now our enemies are going to be moving based on these parameters, and they're nice and clamped. They're not going to go crazy. So we can actually test this out by running a console log. Let's console log each enemy in this for each. One thing we'll want to make sure we do is import it in the index.js file. Now we need to test our process. To do that, we'll have to actually have an enemy in a simulator that has the CRM. To set that up, we'll have to add a mutation to add the enemy and then update our class with a method to do that. So let's do the class first. All that we need to do is just add a method for add enemy, and we'll have an enemy that it passes in, and this will just add that enemy to our enemies list. And just to make sure that this is resilient, we will put in a default as a blank, and it'll just use the default values from the class up here. Now we will go to our type defs and add a mutation, CRM add enemy, and we won't worry about actually defining the values for the enemy, it'll just create one. Okay, and now we can go to our events and add an event for CRM add enemy. That will take the ID, and we'll use our perform action, get the system, and then we'll do sys.add enemy. And since there's nothing, I will just pass an empty object. Okay, now we should be able to see this in action. Let's go to our GraphQL playground, and we will just query our currently running flights, get any simulators in those flights, get the ID of the simulator and any systems, and we'll get the ID and name of the system. That will give us our simulators, our flights, and down here we can see our CRM system. One thing that we'll want to check also is to make sure that our flight is running, which it looks like it's not running, so we're going to want to make sure that we start the flight. We'll do that with a mutation. Let's get the ID of our flight, and then we will run our mutation, grab the ID of our flight, and now we can see that the flight is running. Now we need another mutation to add. Now, and if we take a look at our terminal, we see that there's no output because even though the flight is running, that process is running, we don't have any enemies, so they're not going to be changing at all. So we'll add an enemy really quick, CRM add enemy, and we just have to put in the ID of our CRM system, which is right down here. And if we run that, we will see this start to go. And it looks like it's changing the velocity, and we can see the position change as well. It looks like it's moving in a kind of relatively erratic fashion. That's how processes work. Just as a quick recap, a process lives in the processes folder. You want to make sure you import it from index, and it's just a function that you call after you define it. You make sure that you call it with a set timeout inside of the function definition. The timeout is just a little better than set interval. You want to get all of the flights that are running, get the simulators from that flight, and then perform any action that you want on the systems in that simulator. In this case, we're just changing the velocity and position values and then logging that to the console.